Okay with that.
Okay, so we are now recording.
Thank you so much. And I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Now, I feel free to interrupt me or ask questions as we go. I would prefer just to keep this as informal as possible. But I did prepare a few slides just to give you context around the field of global health. And so just generally, what is global health and who does the work? So let me get this going. There we go. And then just to the crowd, when you hear global health, what are some of the things that pop up? You can put in the chat or feel free to unmic yourself and give some thoughts. No wrong answers. WHO, yeah.
I think of access or lack of access, relative access to not only health services when you're ill, but also to things like nutrition, education, frankly,
Right.
and all the disparities that exist across the world.
That's great. COVID. I think of COVID these days.
Yeah.
That's a big one. Infectious diseases is kind of a big one. A lot of times I hear things like, Doctors Without Borders, the World Health Organization, which I think was in the chat, CDC. Before COVID, people would bring up Ebola. That was one of our biggest outbreaks that we had in the more recent years. Dee Dee, did you have something you wanted to say?
Oh yeah, I was gonna say something about the answer, but I didn't know if you could see the raised hand.
Oh yeah, I don't always see the raised hand. I seem to only see applause.
Oh, okay. I guess I was just gonna say, since I guess global health is kind of like a branch of public health, I guess helping the world, and not only you have to, I guess maybe you don't only have to travel to help globally, but you could stay in your home country and create different organizations to help other countries in different ways.
That's great. I'm so pleased to hear that. What Dee Dee said, what Karen said, those are some really enlightened views around what the field of global health was. In the early days, the field was really around controlling infectious disease. I mean, it sort of emerged in this international health spectrum, but even before that, with colonialism and imperialism, people would go to colonize the land and they'd bring a doctor with them. And that's the deep roots of global health. And we as people in global health have been trying to pull back from that colonial heritage of imposing health on populations and instead trying to work collaboratively. And in doing that, it's actually opened up the field of global health in really, really dynamic ways. So we are, as Karen said, talking about populations that are underserved in resource settings where there's low resources available, and thinking about how to bridge some of those gaps. And like Dee Dee said, it's an extension off of public health. Public health is very much around the philosophy of everyone has a basic right to health. And that is a slightly different paradigm and lens to look through than just we're controlling infectious disease. Now, there's still a lot of control of infectious disease and vaccination programs and that top-down approach, but the field has really opened up in the last 20 years around these collaborative approaches, which means everybody's welcome. We want anthropologists because they can help us bridge better connections with local communities. We want sociologists because they can help us run social demographics and social data a little bit more. We need the healthcare fields and our clinicians because they can help advise and work in capacities that those of us who aren't clinical, like myself, can't do. We want business folks because sometimes there's a financial need that needs to be met with an organization and reevaluation of how money is transferred or how to get funding. So, and then I think some folks had mentioned the interest of climate change. Climate change is a huge area, and in places where there's low resources or low infrastructure, in the US or abroad, you know, climate change is really affecting those communities much in more severe ways and more direct ways for their health than in places where we're kind of buffered, like in cities with better infrastructure. So that's sort of what gets me really excited about global health is that it's not exclusively a white coat anymore. It is an open field for collaboration and a desire and a mission around improving health and health equity for everyone. So this is kind of a general definition for the field of global health that most people seem to agree upon: an area for collaborative transnational research and practice that places a priority on improving health and achieving health equity for all people worldwide. And the WHO, in some time ago, came up with health is not just the measure or the absence of disease, it's a full state of well-being. And so in the field of global health, we adopt that same philosophy that when we're talking about improving health equity, we're talking about improving the world in which people live, work, raise their families, and so forth, not just their own individual level of health. There is a lot of that, but there's a lot of the other too. So I put this here because I think, you know, we all want to go places and we want to do stuff. And so these are just sort of a sampling of a few things that I've done. This is me in Fiji. I do a lot of work on water security and climate change. That's a big area of my research and practice. And this is a village in Fiji here that's just right up on the coast. And every morning in this village, you know, the tide comes in and it brings trash. So before the families and the people who live and use that bay to sustain their food culture, they have to pull all the trash out of the water. So they get up really early and they pull out the plastics and the bottles and everything else. And then once they've sort of cleared their landscape, then they go and they fish in it. And that's when we think about those global connections, sometimes we forget about that piece of it. I took students there on a study abroad project one year, and one of the students would get up with the family that they were staying with, and they would go and pull that trash out. And from that moment on, declared they'd never drink out of a plastic bottle again. They would only use reusable ones. But that's one area where climate change is affecting them, but also just overpopulation and over trash is affecting them. So that's kind of an interesting case. And obviously it's a beautiful spot. I mean, it was a wonderful place to go. This is me in Paraguay. They have a special tea called tirare, which is the cold version of a mate, which is really common in Uruguay and Argentina and Paraguay. And this is me serving tirare. I find it to be quite delicious. Other people find it to be a little bitter. And then this is me in Ecuador. I play violin. And when I was there, we were in a village in the Amazon, and they had invited us to a wedding that was going on. So we went to the wedding. Obviously, it was very casual. And I saw the violin. I hadn't played violin for months. So I asked if I could play. And they taught me how to like fiddle a little bit with what is considered their fiddling. And then I played a little bit of classical, which is part of what I know how to do. So that was a fun kind of cultural experience. And then this is in Hungary more recently. I also do a lot of work on migration. Some of that is migration as a result of climate change, such as a community here. But I also just look at migration. Having lived in Arizona as many years as I did, it's hard to not become engaged and involved in immigration issues. You California folks may also have that experience as well. It's nice to see so many, I haven't had this many California people in a room since leaving Arizona. So it's kind of nice to hear you all. So this is one of the reasons why you might want to get involved. Another reason is the people that you can meet. So you do get that benefit of going places and seeing things and growing as an individual, but you also get to make some pretty special connections. The bulk of my work has been in Paraguay. So all of these pictures are various pictures of Paraguay. This is a woman who, speaking of that tea, and you can see everybody's drinking it. This is a herbalist at the local market, and you have the base tea, but depending on if you have a headache or you're trying to lose weight or you just want to sweeten the tea, there's a bunch of different kinds of herbs that you can add to your guampa or your cup that they drink out of. And women dominate the society. There's a lot more women than there are men, as there is most places in the world. But a lot of the men tend to migrate for work, and so it leaves the women in country doing work and business. So that's kind of a unique feature that I found of Paraguay, but it's not that unique. So a lot of the people who work the market are women, and here there's just the pastime of sitting back and kicking back and sharing and enjoying company with each other while you drink tirare. And when I would do my work, people would say, come the hour of tirare or come the hour of mate, which meant when I would go to meet with them or do household surveys or whatever it was that I was doing, it would be around that social hour of the day, which was also a really special moment. Taught me how to calm down and work at a slower pace. And it taught me about the importance of taking a break and having some tea in the afternoon. So there's a lot of the places you can go and all the people that you can meet and all the good that you can do. And that's part of why I love the field that I'm in. The others that do the work, this is kind of a nice diagram just to give an idea. We all kind of know the WHO, and we know UN, and we might know a few others, and they all are sort of situated here in this little like core part of the nucleus. But there are also larger partnerships. One of the things that Global Health has learned is that in that effort to be collaborative, sometimes one agency isn't enough. So you pull different agencies together on a mission towards, Gavi, for example, is focused on vaccination programs. The Global Fund works exclusively at trying to control the spread of TB, malaria, and HIV/AIDS. And then there's a number of other type of partnerships that emerge. And then in this outer realm are the non-state actors. And this is where I live, right? I'm an academic institution. So one of the ways that I do my work is I partner with some of these different organizations or other partnerships, bring what resources we can to the table. A lot of that is specifically around training. A lot of these areas need research training. They have tons of data, but they don't necessarily have the capacity to run all that data. And they need those data to apply for policy, to make changes in funding. And so that's a way that academic institutions can really try to help bring some resources to the table for groups. I like this diagram just to kind of continue to bring forth that point that it's not one person doing anything. There's a really large partnership called the Rollback Malaria Partnership. And these are all the groups that are involved. And research and academia has a role, Global Fund, because they work a lot with malaria, different foundations like the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation or Clinton Foundation and other groups. There's private sectors, so different kinds of organizations. Sometimes that includes pharmaceutical companies. But all of these, to take on a large project, involves that international cooperation and different agencies and groups bringing things together. This is just, I like this map because it shows how, you know, global health, those doing that international health work, dating some time back, there was just a few different groups. This is kind of the League of Nations post-World War I that was the first attempt. I'd like to think of it as draft one for the WHO. It's the first draft. And then here in 1948 was when the WHO was developed as on the edge of World War II. But since then, with increased globalization, with increased movement and migration of groups, spread of diseases, overpopulation, all of those things, there's just more and more groups that have come up. And I just highlight these. Here in about 2000, as we enter the 21st century, we see even more. It gets steeper, and that's been exciting for someone like myself, and maybe many on the call have probably seen global health take more of a spotlight over the last 20 years. I like to bring this up. This again is more of who's doing that work and who's funding some of the work. So these little arrows, even though you can't see them very well, is trying to show directionally where resources are flowing. But Bill and Melinda Gates, they get a lot of notoriety, but their little circle is not as big as the WHO or the USA. USA funds a lot of global health initiatives. We're one of the largest funders in the world of global health. Sometimes that comes as a surprise, but you know, George W. Bush was the one who developed PEPFAR, and PEPFAR is the Presidential Emergency Relief Program that helps to get drugs and remedies abroad to help facilitate HIV/AIDS treatment. And that was a big initiative, and it continues today. And if you go to different parts of Africa, sometimes you'll see his picture framed on the wall because PEPFAR has done so much for so many of those communities. And we often don't think of him as being a big global health person, but that was a major initiative that presidential administration put forth. And then our CDC also plays a huge role, and that's a governmental agency, right? So the US is actually a big supporter of programs. This here is Doctors Without Borders. This is WHO. Like I said, that's Bill and Melinda Gates. And you can see all the colors of gray. And gray is that the organization headquarters is located in the United States. So even looking at this, if you're interested in jobs and agencies and getting involved, the majority of them headquartered here in the United States. And then they support programs abroad. They might send agents abroad like CDC does. CDC sends different folks abroad from time to time. But we often kind of think that sometimes they're headquartered abroad. To do global health, you have to live abroad. And really the reality is that the majority of them are here. A lot in California, as a matter of fact. DC is a big place for obvious reasons, being in the capital. New York is another big location. Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation is in Seattle. So there's all kinds of interesting places, and I always like to bring this up. One of the things that we're trying to do now in the field is to even this out. In that effort to be more equitable, it makes sense that where we're doing this work, there are headquartered agencies that are local there. So in Kenya, for example, it would be nice to see more representation of organizations that are from the continent of Africa represented, right? I see a question here. Would the EPA and DC be considered a part of the Global Health Network? It's mostly, the EPA is mostly domestic work, but the Department of Health and Human Services is considered to be a part of the Global Health Network. So some agencies are and some agencies aren't. There is where the EPA maybe provides insight is kind of, there's an intercontinental climate change group. The EPA is a part of that. So again, the EPA might have a partnership relationship where they're like the Bill and Melinda Gates is a partner for Gavi. The EPA might have some kind of mission where they partner with something, but they themselves are not considered like a part of the network. That makes sense. Good question though, thanks. I saw someone else, I just realized someone wrote that they play violin too. I see that. Yay. And then I heard a few people, and I know you had the diplomacy meeting like maybe last time, diplomats talks, and there's foreign service. So one of the things that has emerged in just the last 10 years is this idea around global health diplomacy. And in order to bring in vaccination programs, and in order to help build and strengthen global health security, which is essentially stopping the spread of infectious diseases, you have to have cooperation between different countries. We see that playing out in real time right now with the COVID vaccines rollout. But global health diplomacy covers all, including non-communicable diseases, obesity, diabetes, all these different kinds of things that a lot of times governments are challenged by. So now some agencies and some governments are asking that the United States send global health focused diplomats. So those would be foreign service people who have a specialty and expertise in global health work. And that's growing and growing and growing now. So I wanted to mention that because I think that's a really cool opportunity, and it's new, and it's an area where jobs are really growing too in terms of the foreign service. And I remember someone saying that. So I just want to, before I jump into like who the Sparkman Center is and what the Sparkman Center does, I just want to kind of open it up. Any questions either about my work or about the field or other kinds of thoughts? I'll ask myself a question. How did you kind of get into this? Oh, that's a great question. I stumbled into it a little bit. I mean, I had the desire to travel, and so I stumbled into it, but I just tried to find as many opportunities to go abroad. And when I started to do that and interact with agencies and organizations and volunteer, and just, there was no opportunity that was wrong, you know? Everything built a skill, everything built experience, everything was a connection. 10 years ago, I worked with a university in Tijuana, and I did a project looking at pharmaceutical trade on the border at different border pharmacies. And that was a really interesting project. It was a side thing. I did some research with someone. Then go forward 10 years, I'm at a conference, and that collaborator is in the room, and I got to see her again and reconnect. So no job is too small, no organization is too small, no travel is too short. You know, all of those build experiences and help to kind of frame where your comfort level is and what you want to do. I forget what DS stands for, but I remember the last name was Win. Did you raise your hands and have a question?
Yes, I do. I want to know, in terms of these global health initiatives, what's the percentage that's done from the grassroots up and top downs, down and the top down? Is it done through like NGOs or through the government, or is it grassroots?
I think that's a really great question. It depends on the initiative. Generally speaking, in order for funding and money to come into most governments, aside from maybe in the UK, different European agencies, Australia, New Zealand, and the US, Canada, but any others we tend to call the global south, often you need the government's backing. It just depends on how the political institution is set up. You know, we have a lot of free agency to do work and intervention work in the developed world. In the less developed world, there's a level of oversight that has to be provided by the government. So a lot of times you have to have a sort of strong financial institution backing the work to enter into a country to do that work. But once you get there, a lot of times you're working with the grassroots that are there locally. what we've learned is that the only way to have any success in global health is to work with local NGOs, local agencies, local grassroots groups. And these can be just barely in office with 2 people in them. And that's why having some of that financial support coming into the initiative, the shared initiative, can really build out the work. In our less developed context, and we see it now emerging in rural areas, the idea of a community health worker program. And community health workers are inherently the field teams in less developed areas that go out and do the checks, do a lot of the sort of initial primary care. And that's often due to a lack of infrastructure and transportation of getting people into the city center where a lot of times the health is located. So when we look at going abroad and doing some of these partnerships, we have to engage that grassroots. We have to engage those local NGOs. The financial institution might be the World Bank or Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation or a global fund, but that's just the channel of funding that is then dispersed to as many local agencies that we can get on board. Karen? Yeah,
Thank you.
you're welcome. Good question. Karen?
Yes, ma'am. I think you basically answered it. It was going to be about funding because I have worked over in Africa, and then also my cousin, they have a program over in Nairobi it's called Take Heart. And what it does is they take care of widowed women and children and stuff. And because I also go out and do rural community medical stuff. And that's sometimes a big problem is you run out of money to help get funds. And like when you're over in third world, it's like we were working with what we had, but when you're done, I'm like, and you're leaving, sometimes there's still not enough money to help carry on what they need. And so that's what I was wanting to know for like grant writing and funding for some of these missions and stuff, and just to how to get more help for some of these countries, because I've even taught medevac operations over in Rwanda to pilots and stuff when they were putting in hospitals. And it's just sad to see that some of the countries that I've worked in, that when we leave, there's not enough money to help them sustain operations to what they need to do to help their people. And that's what I was wanting to try to get a little bit more in depth on what organizations that you could actually look more into for grants and trying to get more funding to help some of these places.
I think that's I'm glad you brought that up, because there's 2 things about that I always think about. One is sustaining organizations, right? Finding a way to build out sustainable programming. And, mission work and some other agencies sometimes get a bad rap because they lack that ability to sustain their programs. And so in one way, it can be a little exploitative because you, for example, maybe offer medication for a period of time, but that there's only a finite amount of time that you'll have access to that medication. And then you have to now try and figure out how to hustle your way to get more medication. It's really, really hard work. And the folks that live in those countries that are trying to sustain those organizations are doing a really big job. And part of that funding model is that there's all these different kinds of ways. Some are, funding through major governmental organizations or funding initiatives, right? Like we have the National Institute of Health, which sometimes, and a Fogarty thing, which sometimes funds big global health programs, and you get money that is government side of money. But really, often what you need in those areas is development work and being able to build out infrastructure, as opposed to actually trying to hit at getting the money for the medication or the money for that program. An example being, a lot of times hospitals and medical clinics will donate a lot of equipment and they'll send it to another place, like Kenya, for example, or Nigeria, and they don't have the same plugs. They don't have the same electrical infrastructure to handle the surge that's going to come from that MRI equipment or, whatever it might be. So a lot of times what we see is that there's a bunch of stuff in a storage room, we call it the sort of clinic graveyard, that can never be used because the infrastructure won't allow for it. So a lot of times we think, what can we do to get this program off the ground? That sustainable paradigm needs to actually include what can we do to build an infrastructure so we can be able to take the resources that we get. And that's a big push and pull because people need that medication. They might not need that strong electrical surge right now. They need the medication right now. And these just bring up what I think you're really hitting at, which is an ethical consideration. What comes first? How do we set those priorities? Funding inevitably is going to set a priority, but these are ethical questions. You want to do good and you want to do service and you want to help and reach populations, and you can kind of do that in one way, but in another way, you need to be finding funding that can help build infrastructure and also support whatever program needs funding right now. And those are challenging.
I have seen one area, like when we're out doing the RAM projects, is people ask for mental health. And that is something that is not coming out. We don't have enough people to go out to do like mental health, because that's just an area that I feel that needs to actually step up across the board everywhere. And I see why doctors do, because if you don't have money to sustain meds or bring doctors out there, you put somebody on a med and then they can't afford it and stuff, and they run out, becomes more detrimental to that person's health and to society. But I think mental health needs to be also more part of the public health programs and stuff, because war, pandemics, everything plays a toll on people, not just emotionally, but mentally. And that's where I see that we have a lot of problems these days with depression and anxiety and anger and everything. And I think that's an area that should be looked at more focused.
I would definitely agree with that. In fact, we're right now we're applying for a large grant to do training abroad with some of the partners that we have in the Sparkman Center around just mental health. But it's not just training the medical professionals around mental health, but also how can you be an advisor on health issues, and how can you build a more culturally competent, because what we think of mental health might not be what they think of as mental health. There's so much in the mental health area that needs unpacking. And so a lot of us who are in the academic setting that can bring some of that, we're trying to apply for grants for that very thing. I mean, when we look at populations that are dealing with HIV and AIDS, and families that are infected, and kids where there's a maternal transmission to the children, a lot of that is just very taxing and tolling on the individual and on the family and being able to care for sick people. I mean, human suffering is suffering in all kinds of ways. And so mental health is definitely a big area where I think we need to be growing. And it comes back to that problem of global health being almost exclusively for hundreds of years around infectious disease. And it's only been within the 21st century that I think there's an appropriate lens being put towards non-communicable diseases, mental health, and just generally well-being and climate. These are all new things that are moving forward. So I think those are really excellent points. Thank you. All right, I'm going to go ahead and come back to just a little bit of information about the Sparkman Center where I work. You're welcome to check us out on our website. The Sparkman Center is kind of like an institute. It works almost in tandem to what the university does. But we have our own vision and mission statement. We try to work as our own partnership. Our goal is to really work for health equity and social justice in resource limited settings, and to bring together interdisciplinary education, research, and global health practice with both international and domestic partners. We have these 3 pillars that, again, is about education, research, and practice. I almost exclusively work in the education, but I do a little bit on community practice and engagement. We have a graduate certificate in global health. If any of you are interested in that, it's the only real requirement is that you have an undergraduate degree. You can be a non-degree seeking student. California has a really great global health system out of San Diego, UCLA, like the University of California system is really fantastic. They also have certificate programs. So if any of you are ever interested in looking at different kinds of ways of expanding your education, but you don't necessarily want to take on a full degree, global health certificate is a very common way to do it. In fact, for graduate education, like of all the options that are available, a master's degree, a doctorate degree, all those things, 70% of the coursework offered is through a certificate program. So global health has not really, there are degrees, I have a degree in it, but it's still so widely appreciated if you get a certificate. This is one way. If you're interested in other options, or you're out in California, you want some recommendations, let me know. There's also Unite for Sight. They kind of got Yale's certificate. Yale did a certificate some 10 years ago, and then they partnered with Unite for Sight, which is a large vision-focused organization working globally. And their certificate is also really fantastic. So you feel free to reach out to me if you are interested in that one. And that's one where you can kind of stack different courses and build your own certificate. So if there's something very specific you want to get, that's kind of a make your own. But a lot of these, some are focused more on policy, some are focused on clinical practice. They can vary, but I'm happy to help any of you navigate that landscape should you have that interest. Also on our website, we have funding opportunities. This is usually for UAB students. I know we have a couple that may be UAB students. Undergrad and grad are welcome. So if you're here or you're planning on coming to UAB, definitely keep a lookout for us. We've got some opportunities for students here. And then for anybody, there's this link to connect, and there you can join our newsletter. Wherever you are in the world, find your local university or big state university, search global health at their university and join their newsletter. You might be able to come up with seminars and other kinds of opportunities to become engaged and get involved where you don't necessarily have to be students to do so. You can just be a part of the broader community. So that's a recommendation I have. And then, here's some of my information. It's just my last name at uab.edu. You're welcome to reach out to me if you're interested in anything at Sparkman. You can reach out to them. I can put that in the chat towards the end. And then I wanted to highlight this program. There's a lot of global health programs coming back to kind of that ethics question that are actually exploiting, as my Aunt Barbara used to say, they just want that money. There's a corruption that can be out there. And so you have to be really careful to find agencies and organizations, especially mission trips and some of those other areas, that they're actually friends of the community, that they're not colonizing that community. And if you ever have any question about a group, you're welcome to email me and I can kind of take a look at it with you. But generally speaking, this is one of my favorites, Child Family Health International. And they have a lot of different kinds of programs for people at different phases of their lifelong learning process. So it's not necessarily just students. Sometimes it's a gap year. Sometimes it's people with degrees. But these are really fantastic programs they've got in different countries with different foci that you can follow. And their cfhi.org is the organization. They even have some scholarships. They are a third-party group, but I know a lot of them personally and really highlight and welcome this as a recommendation. I think that might be, that's right, I had a couple more that I wanted to mention. You know, I think we all never have enough money. So the question becomes, how can we be global and go global when we maybe don't have enough money to go global? And one play that I have been able to really get involved is every place I've lived, I've worked with refugee resettlement agencies or with immigrant special groups. And these are all very grassroots organizations usually. Some states have a resettlement agency, but they only really work with refugees for the first 90 days. After 90 days, they begin to wean off of providing direct support, because the idea is that then the person becomes their own agent and they're self-sufficient. It's very American of us to be self-sufficient. So there's a lot of grassroots group that after the 90 days, they try to fill that void. A lot of the refugee partnerships have also, there's been so many across the United States that have popped up as a result of the last administration, presidential administration, that resulted in so many restrictions between travel and immigration. And that, as a result of that, some of these refugee partnerships, like the one I work with, have also opened up their services to asylum seekers and become sponsors for asylum seekers. And that's just a way to kind of be involved and be engaged and meet people who have a different cultural history from you, and also kind of serve the community, your community, the global community. And I'm happy. I know a few different agencies in California and groups in California. I know a few that have popped up. So again, if you are not in the state of Alabama and just want to reach out, you're certainly welcome to do so. And I think that's about all I had in presentation.
Meredith, there was a couple of students who said, please send the PDF to Miss Stacy so I can share it. So,
Absolutely, happy to do that.
okay, great.
Yeah, and I'll just put here too my email right there. It's just very simple, my name. But I can certainly send that so you can have the links and all of that good stuff.
May I ask a question? One more question?
Sure.
Meredith, it's Karen here. You mentioned Hungary and immigration, and we've just been talking about ethics and politics and the contradictions sometimes between the two. And I've been Hungary a couple of times. I'm fond of Hungary, but there's a very repressive right-wing fascist government. This is my opinion.
Yes,
And
I would agree with it.
yeah. And it's a very anti-immigrant government. So I was really curious to hear you say that you were in Hungary. Can you talk about that a little? Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, absolutely. I'd be happy to. So even though that's a government, yes, he's closed the borders, right? And with all the migration issues that are facing Europe right now, that was a big problem. The other issue in Hungary is that there are different indigenous and nomadic groups. Sometimes they're labeled gypsies, but they have their own sort of ethnic heritage, and gypsy is not necessarily the most appropriate word to use. But they, in the past, are rights to cross borders. and they are considered a refugee group that are no longer welcome to cross borders legally. So even within Hungary, there's a major issue. But what kind of trumps the, I hate using that word now, I'm sorry. What kind of makes it an opportunity for migration work to continue is that the WHO has a regional office there. And so the WHO has a regional office, not in Budapest, but in Pécs, which is spelled P-E-C-S, which is a beautiful place.
I have actually been to Pécs. Yeah.
Oh, it's
Gorgeous.
lovely. And that's where the office is. And so there they continue to provide services and funding and initiatives to academic institutions so that they can still fill the void and meet people on the border and help get them to camps. So that's a big element that remains sort of in spite of what is happening politically through their current administration. And even more complicated about the situation in Hungary is, so reparations were not necessarily paid back to people who gave up their land and rights in the era of Soviet communism and socialism. And now that they're back to a democratic state, a lot of that intergenerational wealth has been lost. So there's a number of internal migrants who are struggling that are predominantly homeless, who live in Budapest, that are trying to work to get enough money to try and reclaim some of the land that was owed to their families over periods of time. And that internal migration is putting pressure on the administration in Hungary to actually make it easier to cross borders, because some of that economic migration that is so should be inherently normalized, I think, across borders, make it easier for people to work, is restricted by the current policies that they have in place. So it's putting a lot of social services in need, and yet those are being cut. Hungary is a really interesting case. It's almost as devastating as some of the things that we've seen on our own border and our own crisis in the last 8 years. And yet I find that there's so many different social groups that are working. Makes me think of something else. When I've gone internationally, the people, I've not encountered that many public health people, to be perfectly honest. I encounter social workers. Social Work International is just incredible. I mean, they are there directing services, providing services, advocating, doing administrative work. And so if you're ever interested in partnering with a discipline of sorts internationally with other groups, I recommend you start with the social work departments and go to the social work. The public health is not always best represented in low resource settings or in places where the government may be in a more fascist model. But social work seems to always be a place of resistance against anything that's cutting social services. And that can be a really great group to partner with. And just Karen, as a side note, and anybody else, I don't know if you had this problem, but there's a lot of really delicious pork that's made in Hungary, and beef. And I mean, they'll have fried pork stuffed with pork, with more pork. And I spent like a month and a half in Hungary, and I didn't realize that I came back from my cholesterol count just like 3 days after. They were concerned. I had to like detox for a month and go back for a second reading.
Yeah, it's the food of people that used to be agricultural workers and used to be able to process all that stuff. May I make a quick comment? What you said about the international borders and the internal migration, I just thought it might be interesting for the other students. When you travel, you run into folks that are moving between countries, and to take a moment and talk to them and to each other, you can learn so much. I wound up running into a lot of Romanians in Hungary. I was in Budapest, and then I was in a couple other parts of Hungary, and I stayed in hostels, right? Because it's cheap, and you meet other folks. And I was astonished because there's still a lot of feeling left from the remains of World War II. You know, all the geopolitical changes in boundaries and stuff. So there are people who, what am I trying to say? Every country is so different in terms of what migration means. And
Yes.
it's really important to listen to people, whether you agree with them or not, right? But at least I learned a lot about history by talking to people who used to be part of what was Hungary, really complicated 80 years ago, yet who have these very strong feelings. And as you said, Meredith, who used to own property, and it's the same struggle, you know, people who have had land taken away from them, indigenous people for various reasons. I'm not going to get into the ethics of it because it's complicated, but we saw that in our class in Ireland.
Yeah.
And
Oh,
so
yeah, Ireland.
it rings true in different ways all over the world.
I think what's interesting, what I find so fascinating about Europe, is that it's so tribal, that there's so much heritage through your family history, and there's still these remnants of tribe connections that, yeah, don't necessarily line up with what's been mapped geopolitically. And even those who maybe don't recognize their ancestry in that way, you still see that, you know, people who are like, oh, my family lives in Poland, but we're really Slovakian, you know, because the line was drawn, you know. So it's an interesting issue. You know, I mentioned that sometimes you can, in your own community, just reach out to organizations and learn and partner. But when I was in Phoenix, some of the most incredible lessons I had were through my public library, where they would have guest speakers come, and we would have these special events. I remember there was a poet laureate for the state that spoke, and he himself was Mexican heritage, but he was Mexican heritage when it was Arizona territory, and it was originally part of Mexico. And then when they drew the line, his family was divided. And we share a similar history with Europe in that way when we start to dig down and have those experiences and think about the lands that we live on. So it can be very, I mean, I don't necessarily always think of myself as an extrovert, but I'll talk to anyone, you know, and I love traveling for that reason. I love train travel for that reason. I'm a big fan of trains. So yeah, I do. I think there's so much that can be gleaned from just the experience of going somewhere, and you don't always have to go far. Sometimes you can go to your public library and hear a special chat, you know. So.
Does anybody else have a question? If not, we've kind of gone over time a little bit. We always do, though. Anybody else have a question in the chat? Well, Meredith, thank you so much for your time today. We're really grateful. As you can see, it's a very eclectic group we've got. And I really appreciate everybody's participation today. I'm going to stop the recording